So you can move them over. All right. Number 12 on the same page, 174. So Mishum de Beishela Amru. So the rabbis of the school of Rabbi Shela said, Afilut mitpachat shalahen asur lahaniach al rosh sheyesh bo tefillin. So he says, now he gives a very small unit of measure. Oh no, actually mitpachat is the wrapping. So tefillin come just like they come today. When you buy tefillin, they come in wrappings, right? There's things that you use to cover them, which don't weigh very much. So he's using that. So even if you have the equivalent of the wrappings, equivalent in weight of the wrapping of tefillin on your head, so you're carrying a very light object on your head, like a hat or something. It says, Asur laniach al rosh yesh bo tefillin. You can't put that on your head. So he's saying that you really shouldn't carry anything on your head while you're wearing tefillin because it's enough of a distraction. So obviously for here, it's not the issue of the weight that's going to crush the tefillin. The issue is a distraction. Yeah. We're going to be done with this discussion about tefillin pretty soon. But when I've talked about tefillin in the past, there these rules do become liturgical rules. For instance, when you put on tefillin on your arm, you're not allowed to have anything separating the straps from your arm. So that's why you take your watch off, because otherwise there's the danger that the straps aren't going to hit your arm. You're supposed to be able to feel it. Something with your head, if you have some kind of jewelry or something, that you have to take it off. So you're really touching. And they're saying that too. So there shouldn't be anything on your head except your yarmulke, and your tefillin, because that's going to give you the proper concentration. Okay. But he doesn't say that. He says just anything that weighs as much as a tefillin cover shouldn't be on your head. So that leads, of course, to the question, well, is there a minimum amount that you can carry? And remember, that's the whole discussion. The discussion is getting to minimum amounts. Okay. Page 175. Amar Abaye. So the answer is that Abaye says, Afilu riva de pupadita. So it's a quarter of a pupadita measurement. So the pupadita measurement is the smallest pupadita measurement. So this is his way of saying you are not allowed to have anything on your head. Like even the smallest amount, you're not allowed to have on your head. So just a yarmulke, just liturgical stuff. Right, just like a yarmulke and tefillin, that's all you're allowed to have on your head. Don't put anything else on your head. Okay?
How much is pupadita?
How much is a pupadita? The smallest of a gram. Yeah. Well, one of the issues we're going to come to, and you see this too, so there's two issues as we move ahead. They're going to make this very complicated for modern day readers. One is we're back in farming, so there's going to be issues about farming that we have to try to uncover, and a whole vocabulary about farming that we're not familiar with, at least I'm not familiar with. And then there's different units of measure, too, because they're very comfortable with certain units of measure that we don't know. So I've looked them up for your edification, and I will share them with you when we get to those units of measure. But as you're just reading it through, often what's difficult about the Talmud is kind of the twisted logic, and also kind of the very clipped syntax, which makes it hard to understand. But sometimes it's just the subject matter. Like if you're not conversant in the subject matter, it makes it even more difficult. I've found, I've gotten used to the syntax and the logic. So what was for me difficult in what we're about to read is actually just the subject matter, trying to understand like what is going on. About how do you measure seeds, how do you measure crops, things like that. So I've done the best I can with this. And Steinsaltz helps a lot, but doesn't help completely. Okay, anyway. Back to an old discussion. So we've taken a diversion about taking out the trash and weights for wearing tefillin, but back to the old discussion. And I'll remind you, the old discussion, which is the last Mishnah, is that somebody who leases a farm, a field, and the field turns out to be not a good field, can he get out of the leasing agreement? And they say, well, if it depends on how much crop he can get. So what's the minimum amount? And if you remember, the Mishnah says a pile. If you can get a pile out of that field, then you're fine. So, of course, the pile is a very non-specific term. They still try to define it. So a pile is, if you could put a shovel in there and totally cover the shovel, that's a pile. Okay, so the problem with that definition, of course, is that, what do you mean by shovel? I have a small shovel, you have a big shovel. So can we get to something? So, but, this is, what you're seeing here is a culture that doesn't necessarily operate under objective measurements. They say things like about a shovel, about a handful. They're more comfortable with that. It's a more sophisticated society that will come up with very objective weights and measures. And basically societies that are in contact with places very far away from them, where, your shovel's different than my shovel, so we better come up with something that we can all agree on. An inch is this much, and we all agree it's this much. So you can see the transition from sort of informal weights and measures, this big as a shovel, to very objective weights and measures that we can all agree on. And we haven't even gotten there in the globe yet, right? We're still, like, all of us are not really using the metric system, although we promised 50 years ago we were going to move to it. Yeah, but we're really not using it. So, all right. Amar Rabbi Yehuda my kitzba bikri. So he says, what exactly is a pile? What are the measurements of a pile? So that goes back to the Mishnah. So now they quote an answer. Ela im yeshbo kedei nefila. Okay, so that was the first definition. Kedei nefila. Kedei nefila is the following. Okay, you take how much seeds you plant. Okay, and to grow a certain amount of crop. Okay, and the minimum to make a pile is that amount of seed. So whatever amount of seed that you planted to get your crop, that's the definition of a pile. That's kedei nefila. It's the amount of seed. Now, if you're a farmer, and a good farmer and an experienced farmer, you're going to understand, which I'm not, any of those things, and most of us here are not, but you're going to understand that there's a certain ratio of seed that yields how much crop in weight. So, for example, according to Steinsaltz, I don't know what kind of research he did. Wikipedia? I have no idea. But he said nowadays the ratio is about 1 to 12. So for every 1 pound of seed, you're going to get 12 pounds of crop. Okay? So that's sort of the average. So what they're saying is that the minimum amount of crop that you could yield would be, let's say you're expecting 12 pounds, right? Or 12 whatevers, because that's generally what you get. If you just get a 12th of that, then you have to hold to the agreement, and that's the definition of a pile. So actually, they're moving totally away from the idea of pile, and saying, what's the minimum amount in order to obligate you to continue the agreement? It's the weight of the seed. If you were able to harvest in crops and measure it, and you got the weight in the seed that you planted, then you have to continue. Okay? So how's that?
Okay.
I want to make sure that's clear. Okay? All right. Now, what's wrong with this logic?
He gets nothing.
Well, it still depends on every field, right? It's not as useful. Right. So that's not going to be an objective number, because there's all sorts of factors. First of all, what kind of season was it? Secondly, what kind of field is it? There's soil that's more productive than other soils, right? Third, of course, I'm just off the top of my head, the skill of the farmer. Some farmers are better at this than others. You'll see later in the Talmud also it's the way you plant. There's certain methods of planting that are more efficient than others. So again, they give you sort of a way of thinking about it, but it's still not exact and objective. All right, so I'm going to go on. Yeah.
But it is objective in the sense that you could argue that if you this year's crop was a failure.
Yeah.
But you have to hope for the future. So if you have enough seed to plant, you can do it. You can plant again and have a future hope of an equivalent, of your normal. Because maybe this year there was a hailstorm, or maybe this year there were locusts, or something that is sporadic and not under your control. Right.
So the question still is, how much crop did I yield that will give me the excuse to break the contract? Or give me a legal warrant to break the contract, whether there was locusts or not. Now,
it has to be less than the amount you used to plant the field in the beginning.
Yeah. All right, let's go on. So they want a comma kedei nefila. So what they want is, here, give me a generic way of thinking about. So it's not so in general, what would be so Steinsaltz actually does it, the 12 to 1. What would be a logical amount? Because different farmers are going to estimate it differently. One farmer might say, for me, a handful of seeds yields 50, because I'm such a great farmer and I have such a great field. Another farmer could say, a handful of seed for me only yields to me 5, pounds. One pound of seed per 5 pounds of crops. So what's a reasonable expectation? because then you're getting to really what's a pile. Okay, so let me go on. Rabbi Ami Amir, Rabbi Ami Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan says in Rabbi Ami's name, Arba'a Se'in Lakor. Okay, 4 se'as for every core. The se'as are the seed, and the core is the crop. Okay, so sorry?
What's it called?
Okay, I'm going to tell you. I'm glad you asked that. Because I was waiting for that question. Okay. All right, a se'ah is about a handful. Okay? So a se'ah is like, imagine a handful. 1 se'ah equals 6 kav. Now, I know you don't see the word kav there, so hang in there. 10 se'ahs, 10 kavs is 1 core. Okay?
10 cows.
Yeah. 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 Oh, well, let's say at a kav is 1/6. Say at a core is 60. Yeah. Okay. So in other words, that's he's saying a ratio of about 60 to 1 there. Okay. Rabbi Ami Dile Amar. So Rab Ami said, Shmona Se'im Lakor. So he says 8 se'as for a core. Okay? So in other words, so one rabbi says if you plant 4 se'as, you're going to get a core produce. So for that reason, what's the minimum amount? It's 4 se'as. If you can get yourself 4 se'as out of every core that you're expecting, then you have to continue with the contract. But Rab Ami said to him, no, I don't think it's that much. He has a different ratio altogether. He has 8 se'as to a core. So for him, it takes a lot more seed to get a core. Okay? Different farmers, different guys. But for us, just trying to figure out what's the law, we've got a problem because we've got 2 opinions. Okay. Despite the fact that as good farmers, we understand that there's a difference in field and skill of the farmer and weather conditions, things like that too. Still, they're talking on average, and we have a difference here. So we don't have an answer. So is the minimum 4 per core, or is it 8 per core? Okay. Amar le hahusava le Rav Chama. So Rav Chama was having this problem. So, well, what's the law? Is it 4 per core or is it 8 per core? So an old guy, that's all we know about him. Hahusava. Sava means a grandfather. That means an old guy. An old guy said to him, you can read what Steinsaltz says about the old guy. There's these old guys that were wandering around, and they're old enough to answer. They remember. So they answer the question, and he says, "Hahu sava le Rav Chama barei Rabba." He said to Rav Chama bar Abuha, "Asbar Allah, I will explain it to you." What you think is a contradiction isn't a contradiction. Bishnei de Rabbi Yochanan have shmina da'ara. In the years of Rabbi Yochanan, when Rabbi Yochanan was a farmer and he was teaching, the fields were pretty good, right? And 4 se'as could get you a whole kav. Shmeina actually means fat. The fields were fat enough, fertile enough, that just a little bit of seed would get you a lot of crop. Bishnei de Rabbi Ami. So Ami, who says you need twice as much seed, have kechisha ara. The fields weren't as good. Okay? So he's saying basically they're saying the same thing, but they're dealing with a different condition of fields. Right. Okay? Clear?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Now we have where you'll see. I'll just go on. It's changing the subject slightly, but it comes to the same question, which is the question is how much seed does it take to produce how much crop in general? Because it's going to turn into a halacha category. Okay? Tanan hatam. Haruach shepisra et omarim. Okay. So a big wind comes. So you've done all of you've done much of your harvesting. What do you do with the harvest? You bind them into sheaves. What's the Hebrew word for sheaf? Omer. So that's Omer is what we count in between Pesach and Shavuot. It's an agricultural term because that's an agricultural period. It's also a religious period between leaving Egypt and Sinai, but you can tell from the word it's an agricultural term. It's the period between the initial harvest and finally being done with the harvest, being done with the summer harvest. Okay, so you're in the middle of your harvest, and you've got these sheaves laying around the field because you keep them in the field. Okay, and then a big wind comes, a big windstorm, and it blows away everything. So suddenly there's nothing left. There's no harvest. Now that doesn't mean you're out of luck because you go and collect the stuff. You bound them into sheaves and you go and you collect it and you've got it. Who's out of luck? is the poor people who are coming to glean
Oh, it should say.
because there's nothing left. The wind's blown it all away. Normally this is how gleaning works. Gleaning works is you do your work, but you're not going to take everything because some stuff isn't going to be worth your while to take. And also, you just can't take everything. You've got these big fields. And also, you know the poor are going to come, so you're going to leave things. In addition to leaving things in the corners, which you're required to do, you're also out of the goodness of your heart. You're going to leave other stuff. So this gets to really the only example you have in the Bible. And I don't know if there's other sort of literary examples of this being carried out. But for me, this is why the book of Ruth is one of the most interesting books, because you have all these very interesting, really interesting and unprecedented agricultural laws in the Torah. You have the leaving the corners of your field for the poor. And I've always thought what's interesting about that is there's no minimum. Remember that the corner is an inexact thing to say. Leave a corner. You could have a big corner, you have a little corner. It's up to you how much you're going to leave. Then there's maaser, which is a tenth that actually goes to the priests. And then there's the gleanings. And then there's the droppings. All that stuff goes to the poor, and it's a lot. And you read this, and so you read it in Leviticus, and you think it's a really interesting system. How did it work? The only way you can know how it worked is you read the book of Ruth, because the book of Ruth is built on the fact that there was a wealthy landowner, Boaz, who served the poor and homeless of his era, but not just the Jews, because the Moabites were allowed to go and glean in there too. And why did people go to Boaz?
His corners were bigger.
Because corners were bigger, and he had a reputation as a generous guy. So what happens when you have a reputation as a generous guy? You know, just everybody shows up, right? And word gets around. So that's exact. So how does Ruth end up at Boaz's, where they get married? You know, with that love story, and we end up with King David because Boaz is generous, because he's interpreting these laws in Leviticus in ways that benefit the poor the most. Okay, all that's a background for it, okay? And it tells you that landowners would do that. Some were stingier, some would give the minimum, but some would give more. So Boaz was a guy that gave more. And by the way, it didn't seem to affect his lifestyle. He was still a wealthy guy. But he just would leave more, he cared more. Okay. So what do you do? So let's say there's nothing left after the wind comes for gleanings. So then are you relieved of your responsibility? Too bad, the wind took it. The answer is no. You're not relieved of your responsibility. Omdim ota kama leket ruya lasot. So you have to estimate what is a, I'm trying to think of a good death, usually produces. How many gleanings does the field usually produce? So what's a good average amount of gleaning that you produce? Because you've got to get that. So the problem, of course, is the Torah doesn't provide that. It doesn't provide a minimum. It doesn't provide an exact amount. It's going to be a ratio, right? It's not going to be a solid amount, 10 pounds. It's going to be a percentage of your field. Okay, so now we already had this percentage of field. Okay, so turn the page. Okay, you still got to give it to the poor. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, "Noten la'aniim kedei nefilah." So you give to the poor the amount of crops equivalent to the amount of seeds you put in. Okay, so once again, that's not necessarily going to be an exact amount. I mean, I could estimate how many seeds I put in, but in general, some farmers are going to put in less seeds. Some farmers are going to put in more seeds. Some fields need more. Some fields need less. So is it exactly that amount, or is there sort of a general amount that we can have an expectation that the poor is going to get? Okay, so the next question is, v'kama kedei nefilah. So how much is that? So how much really can the poor expected to get in any field? Because you go to that field, you're going to get something, some seed. That field, you get something else. So what's a reasonable expectation of the amount of seed it would take to get a certain amount of crop? And now, unfortunately, or fortunately, we're going to get a very different answer. You'd think we'd get the answer we had before when we were trying to define what's a pile. Because you come at it the same way. It's the amount of seed that creates a certain amount of crop. But for whatever reason, part of it you'll notice is because one group of rabbis lives in Israel, and one group of rabbis lives in Babylonia. So there's going to be different conditions, different standards for farmers. Okay, so earlier we had the Palestinian rabbis from the land of Israel. So now we have the rabbis from Babylonia. Okay, Ki ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came to Babylonia, Amar Rabbi Elazar, V'itema Rabbi Yochanan, these rabbis said, Arba'a kabim, so 4 cobs to a core. Okay, I'll remind you again, 1 seah, 6 cobs, 10 cobs is 1 core. You can do the math yourself, but he comes up with a slightly different ratio. Before we had 60 to 1. You can look at Steinsaltz if you want. Now we have 45 to 1. It's 45 to 1. Okay. Steinsaltz says today it's 12 to 1. So in other words, he says today we're much less efficient. So in those days, one seah of seed would get you 45 seahs of crop. He's saying nowadays, one seah of seed would get you 12. So why are we so much less efficient? I have no idea. I haven't asked my local farmer. Seems to me today we would be more efficient, but I have no idea.
Yeah, I would think it would be more.
Yeah. Anyway, that's fine. Okay. Ba'e Rami. Okay. So in any case, that's the answer. So that becomes the answer in Babylonia. Is that's what you have to give to the poor? You have to give to the poor the amount of seed in weight, the amount that of seed that would yield the amount of crops. But you give it to them in crops. So if you gave them, if it took you 10 pounds of seeds, you would give them 10 pounds of produce, and you would distribute them to whatever poor comes. So you would say, sorry guys, I don't have anything in my field, so I put together this 10 pounds of crops, and you put it there, and the poor have to get it themselves. That's what's interesting about the gleanings too, is that you don't actually distribute it to them; they come and get it. So in some ways, their energy is rewarded too. They're actually doing the rest of the harvest.
They have
Okay.
to put some effort out.
Sorry.
They have to put some effort out.
Right. Okay.
Would
We're
there
gonna.
be fights too?
Well, the only record we have is the Book of Ruth.
Yeah.
And in the Book of Ruth, what's interesting is that they seem to work cooperatively. In fact, it was a group of poor people that told Ruth and Naomi, really go to Boaz, and then Ruth, and they go and they have a little chevra there, the community there. They weren't fighting. Yeah, you would think that they would fight out it, but they actually work out kind of a communal structure where they learn how to share. And that's not central to the book, but you can learn about how those things work from the book, because the writer of the book has no reason to make up a kind of utopian way of doing it. So, but who knows? Like I said, all we have is it's not done anywhere now. It's not done now, and we don't have a record of it being done anywhere else. So all we have is the Book of Ruth, which is only like 6 pages. So in the Book of Ruth, the scene that's painted is actually pretty cooperative. The poor people are cooperating. They're telling each other, go to Boaz, because you might think that they wouldn't say that because they want to get it all for themselves. Yeah.
Have we gotten to the core of the matter?
Yeah.
Not for the Moabites.
On that note, yes. Well.